This is the story of 36 days that turned an island of volcanic ash, barely 8 square miles of it, into the costliest battle the United States Marine Corps has ever fought. It is also the story of one photograph, an image reproduced more often than almost any other in American history, even though the names of the 6 men inside it kept getting corrected for the next 74 years. The battle opened on February 19, 1945, and closed 36 days later on the 26th of March. In that stretch, nearly the entire Japanese garrison of around 21,000 men died, while the American invasion force absorbed close to 26,000 casualties of its own. No other major battle in the Pacific cost the Americans more casualties than it cost the enemy, and this one did exactly that. 27 Medals of Honor came out of those 36 days, more than any single battle or operation in American history, and so did a single frozen second of film, 6 men, and a length of pipe and a flag that would outlast every man who fought there. Thousands of Americans died for a barren volcanic rock most of them could not have found on a map, and to understand why, you have to start with the bombers. By the autumn of 1944, the United States finally held a weapon that could strike the Japanese home islands directly. The B-29 Super Fortress was a long-range heavy bomber, and from newly built airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, out in the Mariana Islands, it could reach Tokyo and return. Everything between those airfields and Tokyo was the problem. Almost exactly at the midpoint of that route sat a small volcanic island, and its name told you what kind of place it was. Iwo Jima means Sulphur Island, a stretch of black ash and sulphur vents with no natural fresh water anywhere on it, lying roughly 660 nautical miles south of the Japanese capital, which works out to about 750 statute miles. Sitting directly beneath the bomber's flight path, that island handed the American command 3 separate headaches at once. The first was warning, because Japanese radar on Iwo Jima could pick the bombers up as they passed and signal ahead to the home islands, which stripped away any chance of surprise. The second was interception, since the island held 2 finished airfields with a third under construction, and Japanese fighters climbing from those strips could harass the bombers in transit and even raid the American bases back in the Marianas. The third headache became the one that would define the whole argument over this battle for the next 60 years. A crippled B-29 limping home on dead engines had nowhere to set down across that vast emptiness of ocean, and Iwo Jima, in American hands, could become an emergency field right in the middle of it. Planners gave the operation name, Detachment, and the case for it reached the Joint Staff on July 14, 1944, argued by the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, Henry Hap Arnold. His reasoning ran along 3 lines. Station P-51 Mustang fighters on the island to escort the bombers all the way to Japan, hand the crippled bombers a runway to recover on, and strip the Japanese of their radar and airfields for good. Taking the island would also shield the flank of the operation already taking shape on the planning maps, the invasion of Okinawa. One thing deserves a marker right at the start, because it sits at the heart of the argument that comes later. The idea that Iwo Jima existed mainly to rescue bomber crews took hold mostly after the battle, after the cost had been paid and the casualty lists had come home, and the numbers come back to it. Iwo Jima is shaped a little like a pork chop, about 5 miles long and up to 2.5 miles across, widest at its northeastern end, and the whole of it covers roughly 8 square miles. At the southern tip rises its one dominant feature, a dormant volcanic vent called Mount Suribachi, somewhere around 550 feet high, though sources scatter the exact number anywhere from 545 to 556. From the beaches below, the figure on a map meant nothing. What mattered was that Suribachi looked down on everything. The ground itself worked as a weapon, soft black ash that gave a man no footing, and one Marine corporal compared trying to cross it to running in loose coffee grounds, with sulphur seeping up through warm patches of earth and not a drop of natural drinking water anywhere on the island. The man who turned this place into a fortress was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, born in 1891 in Nagano Prefecture, into a family descended from samurai. A cavalry officer by training, Kuribayashi knew firsthand the country he would spend his last days fighting. Before the war, he had served on military and diplomatic postings in both the United States and Canada, with time in Washington, at Fort Bliss, and by some accounts at Harvard, and he once wrote to his wife that the United States was the last country in the world Japan should ever fight. Command of Iwo Jima came to him in 1944, and from the moment he arrived he did something that set him apart from nearly every Japanese commander the Marines had met before. Studying how Japan had already lost its earlier island battles, Kuribayashi refused to repeat the pattern. The traditional defense met the invader at the waterline, tried to hurl the landing back into the sea, and when that failed it spent the last of its strength on a massed banzai charge, a final suicidal rush that was glorious, doomed, and over almost as soon as it began. Kuribayashi banned it outright, calling it a waste of men. Drawing directly on the brutal lessons of Pele Liu, he chose a defense in depth instead. The beaches he gave up on purpose. He would let the Americans come ashore, let them crowd onto the open ash, and then bleed them from positions they could never see. To do that, Kuribayashi went underground. Japanese and Korean laborists cut a warren of tunnels through the volcanic rock, positions sunk 30 to 75 feet beneath the surface, linking roughly 1,500 bunkers, blockhouses, and pillboxes, with a main command bunker whose concrete roof ran as thick as 10 feet. By the time the Americans landed, his men had finished about 11 miles of tunnel out of a planned 17. The whole defense rested on one cold idea, and that's what made him so dangerous. Kuribayashi never expected to win. His aim was to make the price of Iwo Jima so steep that the Americans would dread the cost of invading Japan itself, so his garrison fought a war of attrition, ordered to kill as many Americans as possible before dying, and his battle vows told each man he was not to die until he had killed 10 of the enemy. Before a single Marine touched the beach, Iwo Jima absorbed one of the longest pre-invasion bombing campaigns of the entire Pacific War. American aircraft began hitting the island on December 8, 1944, and kept it up for somewhere between 70 and 74 days, the 7th Air Force flying thousands of sorties and dropping on the order of 5,800 tons of bombs. On paper, that was a staggering weight of explosive. Against an enemy buried 30 to 75 feet underground, much of it accomplished very little. The next decision was the one that would haunt the survivors, because the Marines wanted the Navy to hammer the island with naval gunfire, close in and sustained, for 10 full days before the landing. The commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, Major General Harry Schmidt, asked for exactly that. Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy, the naval commander responsible, refused, citing limits on his ammunition resupply. Schmidt came back and asked for 9 days, and the answer was no a second time, which left the Marines with 3. Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, the Marine commander known across the Corps as Howlin' Mad Smith, protested with everything he had. Smith carried the memory of Tarawa, of Marines floating dead in the surf because the defenses had never been broken before the landing, and he feared he was about to watch the same thing unfold on a far larger scale. The men who would do the dying, and who would take the overwhelming share of the casualties, were never even consulted when the plan was set. Then the weather stole even the 3 days, whittling the naval bombardment down to roughly 13 hours of genuinely effective firing. Out of an estimated 915 Japanese fortifications, fewer than 200 had been silenced by the time the Marines went in, and Kuribayashi's underground fortress entered D-Day very nearly intact. The Marines came ashore on the morning of February 19, 1945, hitting the southeastern beaches at around 9 o'clock. 2 divisions, the 4th and the 5th, landed on stretches of sand codenamed green, red, yellow, and blue, with the 3rd Marine Division held in reserve. This was the largest force of Marines ever committed to a single battle, drawn from those 3 divisions, all under Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps, carried and supported by a fleet of more than 450 ships. For the first few minutes, the landing felt strangely quiet, and that silence was Suribachi's design. He held his fire and let the beaches fill. By the time thousands of Marines and their vehicles were packed onto that soft black ash, the general gave his order, and the island erupted, concealed artillery and mortars pre-ranged on every yard of the shoreline coming down on men who had nowhere to dig in, because the loose ash collapsed back into every hole they scraped. By nightfall on that first day, about 30,000 Marines had come ashore, and more than 2,400 of them were already casualties. D-Day also claimed one of the most decorated enlisted Marines in the Corps. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone had already earned the Medal of Honor for his stand at Guadalcanal in October of 1942, the first enlisted Marine to win it in the Second World War. After the medal came a trip home, the war bond tours, a safe path through the rest of the war, and Basilone turned all of it down. He insisted on returning to combat, and he landed with his fellow Marines on Iwo Jima, where he knocked out a Japanese blockhouse and guided a tank through a minefield before he was cut down. Most accounts attribute his death to mortar shrapnel, though a few witnesses describe small arms fire. The Navy Cross he received for that day made him the only enlisted Marine of the entire war to hold both that decoration and the Medal of Honor, and he rests today at Arlington. The single most important piece of ground in those opening days was Mount Suribachi. As long as Japanese observers held the summit, they could see the whole landing area and call fire down onto the Marines below. Taking it fell to the 28th Marines, who pushed across the narrow neck of the island to cut the mountain off from the rest of the garrison, and by the evening of February 22nd they had it very nearly surrounded. On the morning of the 23rd, a 40-man patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, led by 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreier, fought up the steep slope to the crater rim. Around 10:20 in the morning, they raised a small American flag, and the effect across the island was electric. Marines on the beaches cheering and the ships offshore leaning on their horns. Carried up from a ship lying off the coast, that first flag was photographed by Staff Sergeant Louis Lowy of Leatherneck magazine. The trouble was that the small flag could barely be seen from a distance, and a decision came down to replace it with a far larger one. Early that afternoon, a second group of Marines hauled the bigger flag up Suribachi and raised it as the first one came down. That second raising, the replacement, was the moment the Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal caught in a single 1/500th of a second exposure as the men heaved the pole upright. Right beside him stood a Marine combat cameraman, named Sergeant Bill Janorst, who filmed the very same instant in color motion picture footage, and that film would matter enormously later, because it proved beyond any argument what Rosenthal had actually photographed. The real first raising got swallowed almost at once, and it stayed buried for the rest of these men's lives. Corporal Charles Lindbergh, one of that first patrol, became the last living participant of either flag raising on Suribachi, and for decades he carried a quiet bitterness over how the first one had been forgotten. When he told people he had helped raise the first flag on Iwo Jima, they called him a liar and worse. Lindbergh lived until 2007. 3 of the men tied to that first flag, among them Platoon Sergeant Ernest Thomas and Sergeant Henry Hansen, never saw the battle end, falling in the fighting that came after. Rosenthal's photograph did something almost no image has ever managed. The Associated Press transmitted it within roughly 17 or 18 hours, and it ran on the front pages of American newspapers on Sunday, February 25th, only 2 days after it was taken. The composition looked too perfect to be real. The diagonal of the pole, the straining bodies, the wind filling the flag, and that very perfection nearly wrecked his reputation. Here is what actually happened. Once the second flag was up, Rosenthal gathered a group of Marines for a separate, posed shot, a cheerful gung-ho picture of men grinning and waving around the raised flag. A few days later, on Guam, somebody asked him whether he had posed the photograph, and Rosenthal, certain the man meant the gung-ho group shot, answered, "Sure." That one word lit a fire. A Time Life correspondent named Robert Sherrod, along with a Time radio program, carried the claim outward that the famous flag raising itself had been staged for the camera, and a book reviewer at the New York Times went so far as to suggest stripping Rosenthal of his Pulitzer Prize. The accusation was false, and it was disproved. Military inquiries, the magazine's own investigation, and above all Bill Janorst's color film, shot from beside Rosenthal at the same instant, showed plainly that the second raising was a real, spontaneous event and not a performance. Rosenthal had simply stood in the right place at the right moment with the right instinct. The 1945 Pulitzer Prize for photography went to him, the only photograph ever to take the prize in the same year it was made, after the board waived its usual rule about the prior calendar year to honor it. Janorst, the man whose film cleared him, never made it off the island, killed entering a cave on March 4, 1945, his remains never recovered. Rosenthal himself never reached for the glory the picture carried, and his summary of it stayed simple and exact. "I took the picture," he said. "The Marines took Iwo Jima." Decades on, the AP editor who had handled the image, Hal Buell, observed that many people still wrongly believe to this day that the picture was posed. The lie outlived the truth in a lot of minds, which is its own quiet lesson about how images travel. The flag over Suribachi did not mean the battle was won. It went up on the 5th day of a 36-day fight, and the worst of the killing still lay ahead, in the broken ground to the north where Kuribayashi had built the heart of his defense. The Marines drove up the island toward the airfields that were the entire point of the operation, taking Motoyama Airfield No. 1 on February 24th and No. 2 by the 27th. Past the airfields, the terrain turned into a maze of ridges, draws, and hidden bunkers, and the Japanese fought from positions the Marines often never spotted until they were right on top of them. Whole sectors earned names that told you everything. One stretch of high ground became the meat grinder, where nearly 850 Marines died taking it, and the last Japanese stronghold at the northern end was called Bloody Gorge, or simply the Gorge, and it had to be reduced almost yard by yard. This was the kind of fighting where individual acts of survival and courage stacked up faster than anyone could record them. On February 23rd, the same day as the flag raisings, a young corporal named Herschel Williams, known for the rest of his long life as Woody, spent roughly 4 hours working forward with a flamethrower, knocking out a string of Japanese pillboxes that had stalled his unit's advance. The Medal of Honor followed. Woody Williams would go on to become the last surviving Marine recipient of that medal from the Second World War, living all the way to 2022. Moving through every yard of it were the Navy corpsmen, the medical men attached to the Marine units, who crawled into fire to reach the wounded. Of the 27 medals of honor that Iwo Jima would produce, several went to Navy personnel, and most of those Navy medals went to hospital corpsmen. The toll among these medics ran high enough that the National Museum of the Marine Corps records more than 200 deaths among the Navy corpsmen and surgeons assigned to the Marines, counted on top of the Marine dead. By the middle of March, the Japanese garrison was being squeezed into the last pockets at the northern tip of the island. On March 16, 1945, Admiral Chester Nimitz issued the communique announcing that organized resistance had ceased and the battle had been won. The fighting did not stop when that word went out. Men kept dying after the official declaration, which is part of why the precise arithmetic of Iwo Jima is so grim. Kuribayashi held on in the north, and his last radio message off the island went out on the evening of March 23rd, a farewell to the Japanese garrison on Shishijima, a simple goodbye from Iwo. Into his final communications to Imperial headquarters he folded traditional death poems, the formal verse a Japanese officer composed when he knew the end had come, and one of them spoke of being unable to finish his heavy task for his country, of arrows and bullets all spent, and of falling. The historian Kumiko Kakehashi, who studied his letters, read those poems as something well beyond ceremony, as a quiet protest against a high command that had sent so many men to die for so little. On the night of March 25th into the early morning of the 26th, a final Japanese assault, which some accounts say Kuribayashi may have led in person, struck American troops in the rear areas and left more than 100 men killed or wounded. At 9 in the morning on March 26, 1945, The island was declared secure 36 days after the landing on February 19th. Kuribayashi himself was killed around the close of the battle, and his body was never identified, which meant the most formidable defensive commander the Marines faced anywhere in the Pacific simply vanished into the ground he had spent his last months fortifying. Now the numbers, because the numbers are the argument. The American assault force ran to around 70,000 Marines, and across the entire operation, counting Marines, sailors, soldiers, and airmen, more than 110,000 Americans took part. Against them, Kuribayashi held the island with a garrison usually put at around 21,000, with some sources running the figure as high as 23,000. When it ended, roughly 6,800 Americans were dead and more than 19,000 wounded, a total nearing 26,000 casualties. The exact count of American dead is itself a small historical dispute. Most histories settle on 6,821 killed, while the Naval History and Heritage Command's battle page gives 6,871. Both sources list an identical wounded count of 19,217, which tells you the disagreement comes down to exactly 50 men in how the dead were tallied. Either way, the meaning holds. To measure the Marine share of that loss, consider this: more Marines died on Iwo Jima than died in all of the First World War, more than twice as many. The Japanese garrison was all but wiped out. 216 Japanese, exactly, were taken prisoner during the battle itself, while thousands more were killed, and an estimated 3,000 survivors slipped into the caves and tunnels and had to be hunted out over the following weeks and months by U.S. Army troops in a long, grim mop-up. Out of all this came one of the most striking and most misunderstood facts about the battle. Iwo Jima was the only major battle in the Pacific in which total American casualties, the dead and the wounded added together, outran total Japanese casualties. That fact is true, it matters, and it gets mangled almost every time it is repeated, because people hear it and conclude that more Americans died than Japanese. That is not what happened. Japanese deaths outnumbered American deaths by something close to 3-1. The garrison was annihilated. The reason the American casualty total ran higher is that so many American wounded survived, thanks to Marine and Navy medicine, while almost no Japanese were left alive at all. State it precisely, or you state it wrong, more Americans were hit, and far more Japanese died. Then there is the figure that captures the sheer concentration of courage on that island. 27 Medals of Honor came out of Iwo Jima, the most for any single battle or operation in the history of the United States. 22 went to Marines and 5 to the Navy, and 14 of the 27 were awarded posthumously. Those 22 Marine medals, from one battle, account for more than a quarter of every Medal of Honor the Corps earned in the entire Second World War. By comparison, the far longer Battle of Okinawa, fought across 81 days, produced 24. Here is where the comfortable version of the story and the harder question run straight into each other, and it is worth slowing down, because it is the part most retellings skip. The standard justification for Iwo Jima is the one about the bombers, and it turns up nearly everywhere. The American Battle Monuments Commission states that more than 2,200 American B-29s used the Iwo Jima airfields for emergency landings, saving the lives of more than 24,000 airmen. The first crippled B-29 to come down on the island, a bomber named Dynamite, landed on March 4, 1945, while the fighting still raged. Take that figure of 24,000 at face value, and the roughly 7,000 Americans who died taking the island bought the survival of more than 3 times that many bomber crewmen. By that math, the battle paid for itself many times over. That math has been challenged head-on, and the challenge has earned a hearing. A Marine officer and historian named Robert Burrell examined the famous justification and argued that it was largely assembled after the fact, a story built to make sense of a cost already paid. Burrell's analysis cuts hard. Of the nearly 2,000 B-29 landings on Iwo Jima in the months after its capture, he found that more than 80% were not emergencies at all, but routine stops, planes pausing to refuel, to train, to take on extra bombs or fuel, and counting every one of those as a life saved inflates the number past honesty. He pushes the point further. Air-sea rescue data from the period show that roughly half of the bomber crews forced to ditch in the open ocean were pulled out and survived anyway, which means that even if you grant that emergency landings on Iwo saved lives, you would have to cut the saved lives figure roughly in half to account for the men the sea would have given back regardless. Across every theater of the whole war, Burrell notes, only about 2,150 B-29 crewmen were killed in combat, a total that makes a claim of 24,000 saved at this one island very hard to square. The original justification barely came to anything either. Those fighter escorts that Hap Arnold had led with, a later Air Force study judged the contribution of the fighter command flying from Iwo Jima to have been, in effect, superfluous. The doubt is not just modern hindsight. As early as April of 1945, only weeks after the battle, a retired chief of naval operations, Admiral William Pratt, wrote in Newsweek that the island was useless to the Army as a staging base and useless to the Navy as a fleet base. The honest verdict is that both pictures hold part of the truth. B-29 raids did fly from and recover at Iwo Jima. The island did serve as a fallback and as a morale and intelligence asset, and the lessons paid for in its black ash shaped the planning for Okinawa and for the invasion of Japan that never had to come. Burrell's point was never that Iwo Jima was worthless. His point was that the clean, comforting story of 24,000 airmen saved does more emotional work than the evidence will bear, and his thesis drew a published rebuttal from another historian, which is exactly how it should be. This is a real argument among serious people, and any documentary that pretends the question is settled is selling you the easy version. What no argument touches is the conduct of the men who fought. When Nimitz summed up the battle in his communique, he wrote that by their victory the Marine divisions and the other units of the 5th Amphibious Corps had made an accounting to their country that only history would ever be able to value fully. Then came the line that outlived the battle, that among the Americans serving on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. On the Marine Corps War Memorial, that sentence stands carved in its shortest form: uncommon valor was a common virtue. For all the fame of Rosenthal's photograph, the country could not, for the better part of a century, say for certain who was actually in it. The men in the picture had their backs to the camera, 3 of the second flag raisers were killed later in the battle, and the identifications, once made in the chaos and grief of 1945, hardened into official record and proved very hard to move. Getting the names right took 3 separate corrections across 74 years. The first landed in January of 1947, when one of the men long identified as Sergeant Hank Hansen turned out to be Corporal Harlan Block, who had been killed on the island. The man who fought hardest to fix that error was Ira Hayes, a fellow flag raiser who knew the truth and could not let it stand, and who traveled to Texas to tell Block's family in person that it was their son in the picture. The second correction did not arrive until June 23, 2016, 71 years after the battle. For all those decades, one of the figures had been identified as a Navy corpsman named John Bradley, whose son would later write the best-known book about the flag raisers. A Marine Corps investigation, prompted by amateur historians who studied Bilgenorst's film and the surviving stills frame by frame, concluded that the man long believed to be Bradley was actually Private First Class Harold Schultz. Bradley had indeed stood on that summit, but as part of the first flag raising, not the famous second one. The third correction came on October 16, 2019, when the man identified for decades as Rene Gagnon was determined to be Corporal Harold Keller. Gagnon, like Bradley, held a real and honorable connection to the moment, since he carried the second and larger flag up the mountain and brought the first one back down. He simply was not, the Marine Corps concluded, one of the men in Rosenthal's frame. So the final, current roster of the 6 men in the most famous photograph reads Sergeant Michael Strank, killed on the island, Corporal Harlan Block, killed on the island, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, killed on the island, and then Ira Hayes, Harold Schultz, and Harold Keller. 3 of the 6 never survived Iwo Jima. What makes the whole correction story remarkable is who did the correcting, because it was not the institution. The decisive work came from the outside, from amateur historians comparing the film against the photographs, pixel by pixel and frame by frame, until the official record had no choice but to change, and the Marine Corps boards that finally made the corrections did so with help from the FBI's Digital Evidence Laboratory. The most famous photograph in American military history was, in the end, fact-checked by hobbyists. Of all the men in that photograph, the one whose story cut deepest into the American memory was Ira Hayes. A Pima Marine, Hayes belonged to the Acamel Udam people of the Gila River Indian community in Arizona. He had volunteered, trained as a paramarine, a Marine parachutist, and fought at Bougainville before Iwo Jima. After the second flag went up and Rosenthal's photo swept the country, the war pulled Hayes out along with the other believed survivors and sent him home to raise money on the 7th War Loan Bond Tour. His face turned into a symbol while the war he had left ground on without him. He did not wear it well, and the reasons are not hard to see. Only a handful of his original platoon ever came home, and he carried the weight of having lived when so many had not, fighting it for the rest of his life with heavy drinking, arrested dozens of times for public intoxication. He played himself in the 1949 film Sands of Iwo Jima, standing in once more for the moment that had made him famous. On January 24, 1955, near Sackatone, Arizona, Ira Hayes was found dead of exposure and alcohol, 32 years old, and he was buried with full military honors at Arlington. His story was told and retold after his death, in a 1961 film and in a ballad written by Peter Lafarge and later recorded by Johnny Cash, a song that fixed him in the national memory not as a hero on a pedestal but as a man the country had used and then let fall. It stands as one of the rare cases where the legend that grew around a war photograph eventually turned toward honesty about its cost. The 2 flags raised on Suribachi still exist. Both the first, smaller flag and the second, larger one, the flag in Rosenthal's photograph, are preserved at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia, near the base at Quantico, where the larger flag stays on permanent display and the 2 are often shown together around the anniversary of the battle each February and March. The image itself became one of the most powerful pieces of public art the country has ever produced. Within 72 hours of the photo's release, a sculptor named Felix de Weldon had already begun modeling it, and his bronze rendering, with figures standing 32 feet tall, became the Marine Corps War Memorial overlooking Arlington National Cemetery. Dedicated on November 10, 1954, with the President and Vice President of the United States in attendance and Ira Hayes standing among the living, the statue has since had its identifications updated to match the 2016 and 2019 corrections. The photograph also became one of the great fundraising instruments of the war, anchoring the 7th War Loan Drive, the most successful bond drive of the entire conflict, which raised $26.3 billion, and the U.S. government printing office ran off 3.5 million copies of a war loan poster drawn from the image. The island had its own long afterlife, because the fighting did not entirely end in March of 1945. 2 Imperial Japanese Navy machine gunners, hidden away in the tunnels, did not surrender until January 6, 1949, nearly 3.5 years after Japan itself had laid down its arms. The United States held the island until it was returned to Japan in 1968, and in 2007 the Japanese government formally restored its original name, Iwo II, after years in which even Japanese sailors had taken to calling it Iwo Jima. Today the island serves as a base of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, used for landing practice and the occasional emergency, with a few hundred personnel, no permanent civilian population, and tightly restricted access. The dead are still being recovered. The remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers are believed to lie sealed in the tunnels and buried in the ash, and the Japanese government has pledged to find them and bring them home, while American servicemen, too, remained among the missing long after the guns went quiet. Every year, American and Japanese veterans and their descendants have gathered for a joint ceremony called the Reunion of Honor, held on the same beaches where so many of both nations died. In 2025, the 80th anniversary was marked on the island itself, with the senior defense officials of both countries present, and veterans returning captured battle flags to the Japanese families of the men who had once carried them. So come back to where this began: the flag, the photo, and 36 days of hell. The 36 days were real, February 19th to March 26th, 1945, and they killed nearly 7,000 Americans and almost the entire Japanese garrison of around 21,000 on an island of 8 square miles. The flag was real, raised twice on the morning and afternoon of February 23rd, the first time to cheers and ship horns, the second time into the most famous photograph the country would ever take of itself at war. The photo was real, not staged, proven so by the film of a man who did not live to see his own footage clear the record. What the photo could not do was tell the truth about itself for 74 years, and naming the men in it correctly took until 2016 and 2019, the work done not by generals or staff historians but by hobbyists with old film and a refusal to accept a comfortable answer. There is something fitting in that. Iwo Jima has always been a place where the easy version of the story and the harder, truer version sit side by side, the 24,000 airmen supposedly saved against the historian's quieter accounting, the heroism of the flag raising against the wreck of the man who raised it, the single perfect image against the 74 years it took to learn whose hands were on the pole. 27 medals of honor, the most of any battle in American history. Nimitz called it uncommon valor made common, and on that island, for 36 days, it was. The argument over whether the island was worth its price will go on, as it should. The valor was never the thing in dispute, and it never has been.